Welcome to another FastTrackAI Deep Research special report. Pdoom. Probability of civilizational doom. The chance humanity's tech-based civilization crashes so hard we can't even keep the lights on. In this episode, we'll walk through a full deep dive research study that estimates how likely it is humanity could collapse under its own weight, without any help from artificial intelligence. We're talking climate disruption, economic collapse, political conflict, pandemics, and even satellite grid failure. After that, we'll compare it to the oft-cited 10% existential risk figure from artificial general intelligence, AGI, assuming a fast takeoff scenario as early as 2027. Spoiler alert: the model shows that if you live long enough, past about 2042, business as usual might be a bigger gamble than rolling the dice on AGI. Let's break it all down.
Probability of civilizational doom under current trajectories. Introduction. This report estimates the likelihood of a global civilizational doom, defined as a systemic collapse that halts technological development and even strips away the capacity to generate electricity by the years 2050, 2075, and 2100. These estimates assume business-as-usual conditions, no miraculous AGI-driven solutions beyond today's technology, no sweeping reforms to global capitalism or governance, and a continued trajectory of extractive economics, inequality, war posturing, and environmental degradation. We examine multiple collapse pathways and their interplay, including ecological collapse, climate change and biodiversity loss, risk that escalating climate change, resource depletion, and ecosystem failures, e.g., food system collapse, undermine civilization. Economic instability and inequality, the possibility that unchecked inequality, resource scarcity, and financial crises destabilize societies or precipitate collapse. Political conflict and war, risks from major conflicts, e.g. a nuclear war or war economy spiral that could devastate global infrastructure. Public health system collapse, pandemics and health crises that could overwhelm societies, especially with commodified healthcare and poor global coordination. Space infrastructure risks, threats like orbital debris, Kessler syndrome, disabling satellite systems, communications, GPS, etc., which could compound other crises. For each category, we provide probability ranges with justified reasoning and available quantitative modeling for collapse by 2050, 2075, and 2100, along with an assessment of confidence. These probabilities are not precise forecasts, but scenario-based estimates drawing on authoritative sources, IPCC, UN, academic studies, etc. All percentages should be understood as conditional on the continuation of current trends without major corrective action. Confidence levels are indicated in parentheses, e.g. low confidence means high uncertainty. Ecological collapse, climate and environment. Human civilization is deeply dependent on a stable climate and functioning ecosystems. Under unabated climate change and biodiversity loss, the strain on food, water, and habitability could become severe. The IPCC's middle-of-the-road projections do not assume a global collapse. For instance, they still project world population to be 8.511 billion in 2050 and even up to 11+ billion by 2100. But these assume we avoid the worst-case spirals. A minority of scientists warn that at high levels of warming, 3 and 5 degrees C above pre-industrial, civilization itself could become untenable. Below, we estimate collapse odds from ecological factors alone at each horizon. By 2050, mid-century ecological risk, estimated probability, low, 5 to 10% chance, low medium confidence. By 2050, global warming is on track to reach roughly 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels under current policies. This level will bring frequent extreme heat waves, droughts, crop failures, and ecosystem stress. But a complete worldwide collapse by 2050 is generally considered unlikely by mainstream science. Regional collapses or conflicts driven by climate are more probable in this timeframe. For example, climate-driven droughts and crop failures have already contributed to social breakdown and conflict in parts of the Middle East and Africa. A 2019 analysis by an Australian think tank even posited a worst-case 2050 scenario where tipping point cascades, melting ice sheets, permafrost thaw, etc., lead to a high likelihood of human civilization coming to an end by mid-century. This dire scenario assumes climate impacts beyond our capacity to model, such as lethal heat conditions for 35% of land area and collapse of key ecosystems, precipitating mass migrations and conflict. While most scientists view a 2050 global collapse as a low-probability, high-impact worst case, the above claims drew some criticism. We must acknowledge a non-zero chance. Unpredictable triggers like an abrupt tipping point, e.g. a collapse of the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation in the 2040s, could severely disrupt climate patterns, potentially causing worldwide food crises. Overall, the 2050 ecological collapse risk is judged to be in the single-digit percentages, unlikely but not impossible, given expected warming and ecosystem degradation. Confidence in this estimate is moderate. It's supported by some models and historical precedent of societies falling to environmental stress, but a global collapse would require an unprecedented convergence of crises. By 2075, late 21st century, the 50-year horizon, estimated probability, moderate, or 15–30% chance, medium confidence. By 2075, without reforms, climate change would likely reach 3 degrees Celsius or more above pre-industrial levels on a high emissions trajectory. Warming in this range is expected to cause widespread societal stresses. Scientists have warned that 4 degrees Celsius of warming is incompatible with an organized global community and could be devastating to the majority of ecosystems. At 3–4 degrees Celsius, critical ecosystems like coral reefs, the Amazon rainforest, and polar ice sheets could collapse entirely. The resulting impacts, mega droughts, collapse of fisheries, permanent reduction in crop yields, and coastal cities inundated by sea level rise, would put billions of lives at risk. Indeed, research on historical collapses links environmental pressures, food and water scarcity from drought, etc., with the fall of complex societies, though past collapses were regional. By the 2075 horizon, such pressures would be global. The risk of civilizational collapse becomes moderate. We estimate on the order of a 1 in 4 chance. One quantitative indication of this risk, a 2017 study by Xu and Ramanathan projected that under business-as-usual emissions, there is roughly a 5% probability of catastrophic climate outcomes by as soon as 2050, rising further by 2100. Catastrophic here implies impacts that could exceed adaptation capacity, effectively a collapse scenario. By 2075, the cumulative strain of climate disasters and ecological loss, including the extinction of up to 1 million species undermining ecosystem services, could plausibly push global systems past the breaking point. Our confidence in a 15–30% probability is medium. The trend direction is clear, high confidence in severe climate impacts by late century. But whether these translate to full societal collapse depends on how humanity responds. Investment in adaptation, crisis management, etc., which are uncertain in this no-reform scenario. By 2100, end-of-century ecological risk, estimated probability, significant, or 30–50% chance, medium confidence. If current dynamics continue unchecked, by 2100 global warming could reach 4 to 5 degrees or beyond in a high emissions scenario. In such conditions, even optimistic institutions like the World Bank warn we may be beyond adaptation. Several climate scientists argue that warming in the range of 3 to 5 degrees C may be incompatible with civilization, potentially leaving billions of people unable to survive in certain regions. At up to 5 degrees C of warming, parts of Earth would face lethal heat on a regular basis, and fundamental life support systems, water availability, crop yields, stable coastlines, would be disrupted on continental scales. It's for this reason that analysts have referred to unmitigated climate change as an existential risk to humanity, second only to nuclear war. By 2100, on our current path, ecological collapse alone becomes a likely driver of civilizational doom. We estimate roughly a 1 in 3 to even coin flip probability, 30–50%, that by 2100 the compounding effects of climate catastrophe, ecosystem collapse, and resulting famines, pandemics, have caused technological civilization to crumble. Notably, the limits to growth model from the 1970s, which has tracked real-world data closely, projected a global societal collapse, declining population and industrial output, by the mid to late 21st century under business as usual. Recent updates confirm we are unfortunately right on schedule for that outcome around 2040–2070. By 2100, the chance of collapse is uncomfortably high absent course correction. We have medium confidence in this assessment. The physical trends, warming, ice melt, biodiversity loss, are virtually certain on our current path, high confidence. But the exact threshold where global social collapse occurs is uncertain. Hence, we refrain from saying near certainty and cap the probability around 50%. In summary, continued ecological degradation gives at least even odds of doom by 2100 if unchecked, a sobering outlook supported by a range of scientific risk analyses. Economic instability and inequality. Modern civilization stability also hinges on economic and social systems. Extreme wealth inequality, unsustainable debt, resource depletion, and endless growth paradigm can erode the foundations of society. Our scenario assumes no major reform to global capitalism. Profits remain prioritized over sustainability or equity, and the rich-poor gap widens. Historically, internal economic breakdown has played a role in past collapses, e.g. the Great Depression fueling conflict. We consider the risk that in the absence of reforms, capitalism effectively undermines itself, either via crisis or because it exhausts critical resources. A widely discussed study using the HANDY model, funded by NASA, concluded that under conditions closely reflecting the reality of the world today, namely strong economic stratification and resource overuse, collapse is difficult to avoid. Below, we estimate probabilities for economic structural factors leading to collapse. By 2050, mid-century economic strains, estimated probability, low, 5% chance, low confidence. In the next few decades, the world will likely experience periodic financial crises, debt distress, and social unrest due to inequality. However, a total global economic collapse that ends technological civilization by 2050 is relatively unlikely on its own. We expect the global capitalist system to limp forward through mid-century, albeit with rising turmoil, e.g. more frequent recessions, resource price spikes, and perhaps local collapses in fragile states. On the pessimistic side, some models foresee collapse initiating around the 2030s–2040s. For instance, the MIT Limits to Growth World 3 model, 1972, predicted industrial output and population would peak and fall mid-century if growth continued unabated. A 2020 update found that indeed our trajectory aligns with the model's collapse scenario, with global decline potentially starting around 2040. Likewise, the HANDY model scenarios showed that an inequality-induced famine can eventually cause societal collapse, even if the system looks stable for a long time. These analyses suggest a fragility that could, under worst-case assumptions, manifest by 2050. Empirically, Warnings have been raised about a perfect storm of food, water, and energy crises converging as early as the 2030s, essentially a multi-sector breakdown of the global economy. Still, absent a trigger from outside, like climate shocks or war, the more likely mid-century outcome is severe stress short of total collapse, e.g. pockets of the world experiencing state failures while others press on. We therefore assign a low probability, about 1 in 20, to full civilizational economic collapse by 2050. Confidence is low here because economic collapse is often entangled with political factors. Our judgment leans on historical patterns of resilience. The global system has survived world wars and depressions, versus the unprecedented level of global integration and resource strain today, which could make the next collapse truly global. By 2075, mid to late century, estimated probability, moderate, 10–20% chance, medium confidence. By 2075, if current neoliberal capitalist dynamics continue, the accumulated stresses could plausibly break the back of the global economy. Several factors contribute to a higher risk in this period. Resource depletion, e.g. affordable oil, critical minerals, fresh water, may become acute, undermining growth and supply chains. Climate damages will be much larger by mid-century, potentially costing several % of global GDP annually and causing chronic food supply issues. And inequality may reach extreme levels, potentially inciting widespread
unrest or failing consumer economies. Notably, the business-as-usual scenario in limits to growth leads to a steep economic and population decline shortly after 2050. By 2075, we would be well into that descent if the model is right. The NASA-funded HANDY study similarly showed scenarios where elites keep over-consuming while the masses suffer until the system collapses from underneath, a dynamic that could play out over decades. If by 2075 we see a series of global recessions and recoveries getting weaker, signs of system fatigue, one of those crashes could be the last, especially if coupled with food crises or war. We therefore judge a moderate probability, perhaps 10 to 20%, of a full systemic economic collapse by 2075. This means that the odds of collapse increase substantially after mid-century, as decades of unsustainable growth exact their toll. Confidence is medium. Multiple analyses from different angles, systems modeling, empirical trend extrapolation, converge on the mid to late 21st century as a danger zone for collapse, but precise timing and the ability of human systems to adapt, or not, introduce uncertainty. By 2100, end of century, estimated probability, high plausible, 30% or higher chance, low confidence. Looking out to 2100, in a scenario of unreformed capitalism, it becomes increasingly plausible that civilization will have unraveled economically by then. In essence, one might ask, can the global growth-driven economic system run for another 75 years without collapsing under its own contradictions? Several trends suggest no. Unlimited growth collides with planetary limits. By 2100, we would have far overshot sustainable resource use, likely triggering severe overshoot and collapse dynamics. Inequality could reach politically and socially unsustainable extremes, e.g., a tiny elite controlling nearly all wealth, with masses in precarity, a situation historically resolved by disruptive change or collapse. By 2100, either humanity will have made fundamental economic reforms, or the current system will probably have broken down. We assign a 30% or higher probability that the breakdown happens in a catastrophic manner, as opposed to a managed transformation, resulting in civilizational doom. This could take the form of a permanent global depression and state failures, or a series of resource wars driven by economic motives that shatter the system. One can draw an analogy with the fall of the Roman Empire, except truly global. It's worth noting that mainstream forecasts, like UN population projections, don't explicitly model such a collapse. For instance, The UN's high-end population scenario still has 15+ billion people in 2100, implicitly assuming economic functioning, but these projections assume stability and rapid development, which may be unrealistic if crises compound. Given the lack of precedent, our confidence is low when quantifying this risk, but qualitatively we can say, without major changes, a collapse of the global economic social system by 2100 is a real possibility, on the order of 1 in 3 chance or greater. Policies to avert this, e.g. reducing inequality and consumption, as the Handy study suggested, are theoretically known, but in this no-reform scenario, they were not implemented, leaving a high likelihood that capitalism would have consumed its host, the planet and society, by century's end. Political collapse and war risks. Another pathway to doom is through geopolitical strife, either an outright destructive conflict, like nuclear war, or the erosion of governance into chaos, e.g., many states failing amidst war economies and refugee crises. Our assumptions include no new world order or peace regime, militarism and rivalries continue. The 20th century showed that global war, even short of total collapse, can knock human progress back drastically. In the 21st century, humanity has weapons capable of far worse. We focus on 2 main risks: large-scale war, conventional or nuclear, and general political breakdown, authoritarianism, civil conflicts, etc., leading to ungovernability. War could both directly devastate civilization, especially nuclear exchange, and indirectly by diverting resources from solving other problems, a perpetual war economy that bankrupts societies. Below are estimates for collapse via political conflict. By 2050, near-term conflict risk. Estimated probability, low moderate, 10% chance, medium confidence. In the next 25 years, the world faces a persistent risk of major war. The number of nuclear-armed states has grown, and flashpoints, Ukraine, Taiwan, South Asia, Middle East, etc., abound. While a limited conflict might not cause civilizational collapse, a large-scale nuclear war certainly could, via immediate destruction and nuclear winter famine. What are the odds of such a war by 2050? Expert elucidations provide some insight. A 2022 Foresight Tournament median estimate was about a 33% probability of a nuclear weapon being used in war by 2050. More alarmingly, an earlier survey of security experts in 2005 put the chance of any nuclear attack by mid-century at roughly 50%. Our estimate of targets 10% for collapse by 2050 factors in that not every nuclear detonation leads to full collapse. It would likely require hundreds of warheads, an all-out US-Russia exchange, or a cascading series of conflicts to truly knock civilization off its footing. Unfortunately, such scenarios are not out of the question. The Australian climate security scenario noted that by 2050, resource conflicts could escalate to nuclear war as nations fight over water or food. Beyond nuclear, even a massive conventional World War III, with cyber warfare, EMPs, and biological weapons, could destroy the global infrastructure needed for modern life. We judge the probability of any conflict-driven civilizational collapse by 2050 to be around 1 in 10. This accounts for the chance of nuclear Armageddon, a few % per year hazard, accumulating over decades, and the chance of multi-factor political unraveling, for instance, several governments collapsing into chaos and triggering a domino effect. Our confidence is medium. We have historical frequency of great power wars, which suggests a significant chance in any 50-year period, and nuclear risk assessments to go on. But there is inherent unpredictability in geopolitical events. By 2075, mid-century to 3 to 4 century, estimated probability, moderate, 15–25% chance, low-medium confidence. Over a 50-plus year horizon, the likelihood that humanity experiences a major destabilizing war increases. If no reforms occur, by 2075, there may be more nuclear-armed states, proliferation continues, and ongoing regional conflicts over scarcer resources. cumulative probability of a nuclear war grows with time. One informal extrapolation suggests on the order of a 50% chance of nuclear war by the late 21st century if the annual risk is 1% or higher. Domain experts surveyed in one study gave an 8% chance that nuclear weapons cause a global catastrophe by 2100 and a smaller 0.5% chance of outright human extinction. Using these as rough guides, we might estimate perhaps a 5% chance of civilization-ending nuclear conflict by 2075. In addition, there's some probability that protracted conflicts and political collapse in multiple countries lead to a general breakdown of global order. For instance, if climate impacts cause mass migrations of billions by 2075, nations may turn to authoritarian rule or perpetual warfare, undermining democracy and international cooperation. A world of entrenched war economies and failing states by 2075 is certainly possible under our scenario. Indeed, some argue early signs are visible. Thus, combining these factors, we assign roughly a 15 to 25% chance of collapse from political conflict by 2075. We have slightly lower confidence here because it's hard to quantify the synergistic effects of war plus other stresses, but overall, half a century of continued arms races, nationalism, and conflict substantially raises the risk of doom. By 2100, end-of-century geopolitical risk, estimated probability, moderate high, 30% chance, low confidence. By 2100, if humanity has not fundamentally changed its approach to conflict, it may not be a functioning global civilization at all. The chance that one or more full-scale wars will have occurred by then is quite high. For perspective, the 20th century saw 2 world wars and a close shave with nuclear war. The 21st, under worse resource climate conditions, could fare worse. As noted, some analyses put the probability of some nuclear conflict this century in the range of 20% to over 50%. Our scenario assumes no effective disarmament, so even by random chance the risk accumulates. By 2100 we might even see new kinds of warfare, possibly involving space or bioweapons, if technology progresses in arms without the counterweight of AGI or enlightened governance. If a nuclear World War III occurs at any point, it is very likely to end modern civilization. A full arsenal exchange could kill most people via blast, radiation, and nuclear winter-induced famine. Even a smaller nuclear war, e.g. between India and Pakistan, could put billions at risk from global famine, potentially destabilizing the world system. Additionally, political erosion could reach a point where global coordination is impossible. For example, a world fragmented into fortified zones after wars, with collapsed economies and constant local conflicts, a Mad Max scenario. We estimate Bauer's 30% probability that by 2100, political and conflict factors have caused civilizational doom. This could be through one big catastrophe, nuclear holocaust, or the cumulative effect of many wars and breakdowns, degrading humanity's capacity to maintain infrastructure. Confidence in this number is low. It's challenging to model century-long political futures, but we lean toward a fairly high risk given historical patterns and the fact that each passing decade with active war risks is a roll of the dice. In summary, without a shift toward peace and cooperation, there is a substantial chance that war or political chaos will finish off global civilization by the end of the century. Public health and pandemic collapse risks. Global civilization is also vulnerable to pandemic diseases and public health failures. In our scenario, healthcare remains a commodity unevenly accessible, and there is no major overhaul of global health security. This means high potential for infectious disease outbreaks to spiral. The COVID-19 pandemic gave a mild preview. It caused a severe but temporary economic shock and killed perhaps 15-20 million people worldwide. A more lethal pathogen could do far worse. Climate change, biodiversity loss, and population pressure increase the odds of novel pandemics through habitat disruption, wildlife contact, etc., and globalization can spread them rapidly. we consider whether pandemics could cause collapse on their own or as a trigger amidst other stresses. By 2050, next 25 years, estimated probability, low, 5% chance, low confidence. Epidemiologists broadly agree another pandemic is inevitable in coming decades. A 2022 statistical analysis estimated we face about a 2% chance in any given year of a COVID-19 level pandemic, i.e., killing on the order of 120 plus million people, and that this risk is rising with climate change. Indeed, a recent Lancet commission put the probability of a pandemic as severe as COVID in the next 10 years at 23%, and within 25 years nearly 50%. So by 2050, there is roughly an even chance we will have experienced at least one major global pandemic of that scale. Would that equate to civilizational collapse? Likely not by itself. COVID, while devastating, did not permanently cripple the global system. However, a few scenarios could cause collapse. 1. A pandemic far more lethal than COVID, say a flu or engineered pathogen that kills, for example, 10% plus of humanity, or a genetically engineered super plague, could so thoroughly disrupt economies and state functions that recovery is impossible. 2. A pandemic striking in tandem with other crises, e.g., during a famine or war, a disease emerges and society cannot cope with both. Given no major changes to health systems, the world in 2050 could actually be more vulnerable in some ways. Antibiotic resistance could make ordinary infections deadly again, and unequal healthcare means outbreaks can rage in some regions. Still, we assign only around a 5% chance that by 2050, a pandemic or health system collapse has alone toppled civilization. This is low because it likely requires an extreme pathogen. The natural chance of one causing human extinction or permanent collapse is often estimated under a few percent by 2100. Confidence is low. Pandemic risk modeling is highly uncertain. The key point: the risk is definitely non-zero for an early collapse via disease, especially as experts warn of a new era of pandemics. By 2075, mid to late century health risks, estimated probability, low moderate, tot 10% chance, low confidence. Over 50 plus years, the cumulative probability of encountering a truly devastating pandemic increases. If each decade carries, say, a 20-30% chance of a severe outbreak, per the Lancet study and other sources, by 2075, we could have weathered multiple pandemics. Repeated shocks could erode global resilience. Also, climate change will expand tropical disease ranges and possibly release long-frozen pathogens, e.g. from permafrost. In a grim scenario, suppose by 2075 we've seen a deadly airborne virus that kills hundreds of millions, and perhaps later an antibiotic-resistant plague, each time chipping away at our complex systems. If no robust international health response exists, these could synergize with other stresses. For example, a pandemic during a massive crop failure could compound death tolls. The probability that public health factors cause collapse by 2075 might be on the order of 10%. We consider both direct pandemic impacts and health system collapse, the latter meaning hospitals and medical supply chains break down, leading to unchecked disease and declining life expectancy, a slow burn collapse. Notably, the Black Death in the 14th century killed an estimated 30 to 50% of Europe's population. European society eventually rebounded, but that was in a pre-industrial context. If something comparably severe hit a high-tech, interdependent world, the outcome could be worse due to how tightly coupled our systems are. Our POMR 10% estimate is highly uncertain, low confidence, as it's hard to foresee the evolution of pathogens. It assumes no major improvements in pandemic preparedness. If in reality governments learn from COVID and significantly bolster healthcare and cooperation, the risk would be lower. But under our no major reform premise, we aren't banking on that. By the end of the century, if trends hold, humanity will likely have been challenged by multiple novel pathogens. Some could be natural, zoonoses jumping species, others potentially man-made, bioterror or accidental releases, given biotechnology will advance even without AGI. In a worst-case chain of events, one of these pandemics might be extreme enough to essentially collapse civilization. For example, a genetically engineered virus with high lethality and transmissibility could theoretically emerge by 2100, given the proliferation of biotech, even if we assumed no AGI. Current tech is already capable of editing genomes. The probability of an existential or civilizational-ending pandemic has been estimated by certain researchers. Often it's grouped under engineered pandemics, with a few % chance by 2100. Toby Ord, a risk expert, gives roughly a 3% chance for unaligned AI and engineered pandemics combined in his book The Precipice, though separating them is difficult. Our 20% figure by 2100 encompasses both naturally arising plagues and the cumulative toll of a failing global health paradigm. By 2100, climate impacts, e.g. displacement, malnutrition, could also make populations more vulnerable to disease, and if earlier crises, war, economic, occurred, the remnants of humanity might lack the capacity to fight an outbreak. This scenario is highly uncertain, hence low confidence, but it recognizes that pandemic risk is one of the wildcard threats that could strike at any time. In summary, while human extinction via disease is considered unlikely, a collapse to a pre-industrial state due to repeated plagues and no recovery is a serious possibility on century timescales. Multiple experts have called for greater focus on such global catastrophic biological risks. Space infrastructure risks, orbital debris cascades. Though more peripheral than the above factors, the collapse of critical infrastructure systems can contribute to civilizational doom. One often overlooked risk is the loss of our space-based infrastructure, satellites that provide communications, GPS navigation, timing for electrical grids, weather monitoring, etc. The scenario of concern is the Kessler syndrome, a self-perpetuating cascade of orbital collisions producing so much debris that low Earth orbit becomes unusable. Currently, there are over 56,000 tracked objects in orbit, of which only 8% are active satellites. The rest is junk. With plans for mega constellations, e.g. tens of thousands of new satellites by the 2030s, the risk of collision is growing exponentially. The United Nations University in 2024 identified space debris as a system nearing a tipping point, warning that projected launches could dramatically increase the odds of cascading collisions. We assess how this risk could contribute to collapse. By 2050, estimated probability, low, 5% chance of serious impact, medium confidence. In the next 25 years, the number of satellites will soar. Over 100,000 new satellites could be launched by 2030, according to projections. Without stringent debris mitigation, there is a real possibility of a major collision event. A single collision of big objects, say 2 defunct satellites or a satellite and leftover rocket body, can generate thousands of fragments. More than 560 in-orbit fragmentation events have been recorded since 1961, and as traffic increases, an uncontrollable chain reaction becomes more likely. If a Kessler syndrome kicked off before 2050, low Earth orbit might become littered with fast-moving shrapnel, destroying many satellites. This would be disastrous for modern civilization's communications and coordination. We could lose satellite internet, global telephony, GPS timing, which financial systems and power grids rely on, and Earth observation capabilities. On its own, this wouldn't kill people directly, but it could blind and deafen our advanced systems, making it far harder to manage other crises. For instance, imagine trying to respond to a global pandemic or coordinate food shipments with no GPS and spotty communications. Therefore, while the direct probability of orbital infrastructure collapse by 2050 is relatively low, 5% as an order of magnitude guess, the indirect risk it poses is meaningful. We have medium confidence in a low probability because space agencies are aware of debris issues and may take action. But given the commercial space race, accidents could outpace regulation. Indeed, some forecasters have put the odds of Kessler syndrome by mid-century in the few percent to tens of percent range, reflecting considerable uncertainty. We include this mainly as a compounding factor. It's unlikely to alone cause civilizational doom by 2050, but it could tip the scales if humanity is already struggling. By 2075, estimated probability, low moderate, 10% chance of disabling space infrastructure, medium confidence. By 2075, if we have continued to launch satellites recklessly, one might expect at least one major orbital debris cascade to have occurred, or at minimum that key orbits, like the popular polar and equatorial LEO bands, have become polluted with collision shrapnel. Absent aggressive debris removal efforts, the probability of Kessler syndrome increases with each decade of high launch rates. We might estimate on the order of 10% chance by 2075 that low Earth orbit is largely destroyed as a usable resource. The implications for civilizational collapse are indirect but serious. Loss of space-based navigation and communication could be a fatal blow to a teetering tech-dependent society. Consider that even basic things like shipping and air travel heavily rely on GPS. A sudden loss would cause chaos. Additionally, military early warning satellites for detecting missile launches would be gone, potentially leading to greater risk of accidental war. So, by 2075, we rate the collapse contribution from space infrastructure failure as modest but non-negligible. Confidence remains medium. By this time, either we will have adapted, perhaps using more terrestrial systems or cleaning debris, or we suffer the consequences. In a no-reform world, it's plausible we ignore the problem until it's too late. By 2100, estimated probability, moderate, 20% chance, low medium confidence. Towards 2100, if current practices continue, it's quite conceivable that Earth's orbits, especially low and medium Earth orbit, become highly cluttered or effectively inaccessible. Some experts have even mused that we could inadvertently trap ourselves on Earth for generations if we render orbit unusable, since rockets would be destroyed by debris on ascent. While it's hard to quantify precisely, we assign perhaps a 20% chance that by 2100, our space infrastructure has suffered a collapse, either sudden or gradual, due to debris and lack of sustainable management. By that point, civilization would have lost one of its vital nervous systems. If humanity is already pushed into a survival scenario by climate or war, losing satellites could be the final straw that prevents any recovery or technological reboot. For example, if electricity grids fail, one of the ways to restore networks is via satellite links, which would no longer be available. Our confidence in the exact probability is low to medium, as human behavior in space is tough to predict. We might wise up and enforce debris rules, or we might not. However, we flag this risk because it exemplifies how even high-tech domains are subject to systemic failure under unchecked capitalist expansion, commercial satellite mega-constellations racing for profit without adequate regulation. As one analysis succinctly put it, the Kessler syndrome could quickly make Earth orbit unusable, and the cascading consequences on civilization would be dire in conjunction with terrestrial crises. Overall collapse probability. Outlook. Bringing all dimensions together, we now estimate the overall probability of civilizational doom by 2050, 2075, and 2100 under the no-change scenario. Since multiple crises can act in concert, the combined risk is higher than any single factor alone. We will present ranges to reflect uncertainty, and confidence levels for these integrative estimates are generally low. The farther in the future, the more uncertainty. By 2050, we estimate the overall probability of civilizational collapse by mid-century to be on the order of 10–15%, roughly a 1 in 10 chance. This is a rough integration of the low to moderate risks from climate ecological stress, 5 to 10%, war, 10%, etc., recognizing these can overlap. In plain terms, there is a real but not predominant chance that humanity fails to make it to 2050, with an intact global technological civilization. Key drivers in this timeframe would likely be a severe war or a rapid climate destabilization. For example, a nuclear exchange during a climate-induced resource war could cause collapse in the 2040s. Our confidence in this 10–15% range is moderate given current trend data and expert surveys. For instance, a majority of security and risk experts anticipate at least some form of global catastrophe risk in the next decade, though not necessarily full collapse. Most evidence suggests we will see escalating crises by 2050, but society might stagger through them without total collapse. It is worth noting that some analyses, like the breakthrough climate scenario, claim a high likelihood of collapse by 2050 if no action, but mainstream science disputes it as too pessimistic for 2050 specifically. Hence, we err on the side of a modest probability for mid-century doom, acknowledging significant uncertainty. By 2075, the probability of collapse substantially increases as stresses compound. By 2075, we estimate roughly 130%, perhaps between 20 to 40% chance of civilizational doom. In other words, a distinct possibility that the world as we know it falls apart by the three-quarter century mark. This takes into account that by the 2060s and 2070s, we will likely be in the throes of serious climate disruption, 3 degrees C plus warming, possible resource exhaustion, and heightened conflict. For example, climate models project conditions by year 2075 that could include permanent droughts in key breadbaskets and regular deadly heat waves, making parts of the tropics uninhabitable. It is hard to imagine the global economy functioning under such conditions without upheaval. If we also factor the significant chance of at least one major nuclear conflict by this time, various estimates put the likelihood of a nuclear war within any given 50-year period in the tens of percent. The 30% collapse probability seems justified. Confidence is low to medium. We have stronger evidence about what the world will look like, physically and demographically, by 2075 if we continue on course. But how exactly the social systems respond is uncertain. Still, multiple credible sources point toward mid-late century collapse risk. As a salient example, a poll of environmental scientists and scholars found a significant minority who think civilization could start collapsing by 2070 under current trends, prompting calls to study these climate endgame scenarios seriously. Our 30% estimate aligns with treating collapse as a real possibility by 2075, though not a foregone conclusion. By 2100, if humanity truly continues on the present trajectory with no major course corrections, the chance of civilizational doom by 2100 becomes alarmingly high. We estimate on the order of 50% or greater. In essence, it may be as likely as not that civilization as we know it does not survive the 21st century under business as usual. This assertion is grounded in the convergence of all the risk factors by century's end: extreme climate change, potentially 4 to 5 degrees C warming, with impacts that scientists say could reach beyond adaptation; ecological collapse, mass extinction, ecosystem services failing; potential multiple global wars or a nuclear holocaust, with cumulative war probability being quite high over 8 decades, and possibly repeated catastrophic pandemics. Any one of these factors could be devastating. In combination, it's hard to see technological civilization coping. To illustrate, the World Bank has noted that at 4 degrees C warming, there is no certainty that adaptation is possible and a collapse of modern societies could occur. Meanwhile, risk analysts like the late Professor Martin Rees and others have put the odds of civilizational ending events within this century at around even. Rees famously gave humanity 50-50 odds of making it through the 21st century intact, accounting for all risks. Our tossed 50% estimate resonates with such assessments. It is also indirectly supported by the fact that when you aggregate the probabilities of various catastrophes by 2100, nuclear war, climate catastrophe, global pandemic, etc., the total doom probability indeed starts to approach or exceed 50%. For example, one compilation of expert forecasts suggests a 1 in 6 chance of existential catastrophe by 2100, including AI. Remove the AI portion and allocate more to climate and political collapse, since we assume no AI revolution, and you still get on the order of 1 in 5 or 1 in 4. Our scenario being particularly pessimistic, no mitigation at all, pushing the odds up to 50% is not unreasonable. That said, confidence is low at this range. There is a wide margin of error because it's a unique, never-before-experienced outcome. We should interpret 50% not as a precise figure, but as an indication that humanity's future is truly on a knife's edge under current trajectories. It is just as much a call to action as a prediction. Conclusion. In summary, under the continuation of current global capitalist dynamics and failures, the risk of civilizational collapse rises from perhaps 10% by 2050 to 30% by 2075 to around 50% or higher by 2100. Each category of threat, ecological, economic, political, health, and technological, contributes to these odds, often in reinforcing ways, a polycrisis scenario. Our confidence in these estimates varies from low to medium, given the unprecedented nature of a global collapse. However, the qualitative trend is clear and backed by numerous authoritative analyses. The longer we proceed on the present course, the greater the likelihood that the global system will unravel. It is important to note that these probabilities are not fate. They are contingent on the assumption of no significant change in policy or technology. In reality, society could still choose to enact reforms or innovations to mitigate these risks. The same sources warn that urgent action in the 2020s could ensure a sustainable future and avoid the doomsday outcome. Nevertheless, as requested, we have evaluated the status quo trajectory. And on that course, the odds of doom by century's end are distressingly high, calling to mind the adage that if something cannot go on forever, it will stop. Current global practices, by many credible accounts, cannot go on forever without a collapse. By 2100, long-term pandemic health risks. We've run the numbers straight from the research. Status quo curve skyrockets. From 5% cumulative risk today to coin flip territory by 2100. AGI adds a flat 10% existential tail. Big but constant in this toy model. Time horizon dictates which danger dominates. If you only plan to be alive to 2042, the AGI risk looms larger. Live past that, and the polycrisis curve dwarfs it. So the real question isn't, is AI safe? But, can civilization survive without help that powerful? Let us know in the comments. Would you greenlight AGI knowing it adds a 1 in 10 doom chance up front if the alternative is a 1 in 2 crash by century's end? Like, sub, share. More FastTrackAI Deep Research drops every week. Stay curious and stay in the game.